Imagine a colonial administration setting up this small, strictly controlled school.
Right.
And there's basically one absolute rule, right? You are only here to teach the local population how to be carpenters or mechanics, builders.
Keep it strictly math.
Exactly. You are definitely not there to create philosophers. You are not creating political scientists. And you are, without a doubt, not creating leaders.
Yeah, that was the grand plan.
But then, imagine returning to that exact same institution a few decades later, and you realize you accidentally created the founding fathers of like 3 independent nations.
What?
You've created the greatest literary minds of an entire continent and a global hub for disease research.
All from a carpentry school.
All from a carpentry school. So if you love a shortcut to being well-informed without, the whole information overload thing, you were in the right place. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're exploring an institution that is frequently called the Harvard of Africa.
Yeah, we're taking a trip to the hills of Kampala in Uganda to look at Makerere University.
And we've got some incredible source material today documenting its history. But, is that comparison fair? The Harvard of Africa?
It is a really fitting title in terms of prestige. But honestly, comparing it to Harvard almost doesn't do the sheer drama of Maker's story justice.
How so?
Well, think about Harvard. It was founded, relatively peacefully just to train ministers for a colony.
Right.
Maker's trajectory is this crazy century-long arc of survival. It's subversion. It's just sheer intellectual willpower.
It's a completely different scale of adversity.
Totally. It went from being a literal tool of the British colonial administration to an anti-colonial political incubator to surviving a devastating dictatorship. And now it's this 21st century powerhouse for artificial intelligence and global health.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we really have to start at the literal beginning, right, in the 1920s.
Yeah, 1922.
And the supreme irony of Maker's origins compared to its eventual destiny is just, it's wild to me.
It really is. So in 1922, the British colonial administration establishes the Maker Technical School.
Right.
And you have to remember, at this time, higher education for Africans was virtually non-existent. And the colonial government, they deliberately wanted to keep it that way.
They weren't looking to educate. They were looking to extract.
Exactly. The initial enrollment was literally 14 boys. Just 14. And the goal was hyper-utilitarian. They just needed artisans.
Right, because they didn't want to import expensive British labor to maintain the infrastructure of East Africa.
Far too expensive.
So they needed local cogs for the colonial machine, basically. People who could follow a blueprint, build a wall, or repair a government vehicle.
Keep the ambitions incredibly low.
Yeah, it's like hiring someone just to build a wooden bookshelf for you, only for that person to end up writing all the brilliant books that actually go on it.
That is exactly what happened. Because this is where the British administration fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of education.
Oh.
What's fascinating here is the underlying mechanism of learning itself. You cannot isolate technical training from intellectual curiosity.
Wait, I want to challenge that a bit. Because, how does teaching someone to build a brick wall or, repair a truck engine translate into them organizing a massive political independence movement?
Well,
Those seem like 2 completely different universes.
they seem different, yeah. But to build a wall properly or to engineer a functioning bridge, you can't just memorize physical motion.
Okay.
You have to be taught mathematics. You have to be taught physics. You have to learn how to calculate load-bearing stress.
Ah, I see where you're going.
Right. You are giving these students the fundamental tools of systems thinking. And once you teach a human being how to analyze the structural integrity of a physical bridge.
They inevitably turn around and start analyzing the structural integrity of the society they live in.
Yes. They start asking, wait, why is the social structure built this way? Who designed it? And why am I at the very bottom of it?
Oh, wow. That is brilliant. You can't spark the desire for technical learning without accidentally igniting a broader thirst for critical thought.
Precisely. The administration simply could not contain the intellectual demand they had inadvertently created.
So it starts snowballing.
Massively.
Yeah.
The evolution of the school was incredibly rapid. Just 13 years after opening to those 14 boys learning carpentry, in 1935, it expands into Maker College.
Okay.
And now they are offering courses in medicine, agriculture, and teacher training.
Which is a huge paradigm shift. But the real game changer, according to our sources, happens in 1949, right?
Yes, 1949 is huge.
Maker becomes an overseas college at the University of London system.
Yep.
Practically speaking, what did that actually look like for a student walking around Kampala?
It meant that the academic ceiling was entirely shattered.
Okay.
Before 1949, you might get, like, a local certificate.
Yeah.
After 1949, African students could earn internationally recognized degrees from the University of London
Without ever leaving the African continent.
without leaving. And the mechanism for this was strictly controlled to ensure quality. The exams were drafted in London, shipped in sealed envelopes all the way to Kampala,
Oh.
taken by the students at Maker, and then shipped back to London to be graded right alongside the exams taken by British students.
And the Maker students were passing them.
They were passing them. They were proving they could compete on the exact same global, rigorous academic stage.
So they basically called their bluff.
Exactly. This was the moment Maker officially transitioned from a colonial technical outpost into a legitimate world-class academic institution.
And once you have internationally recognized degrees available right in the heart of East Africa, Maker naturally becomes this massive magnet.
Oh, yeah, a huge draw.
Which means we transition from what the university was to who was actually walking its halls.
Right.
In the 1950s and 1960s, it stops being just a Ugandan school. It becomes the center for producing Africa's emerging elite.
This is universally considered the golden foundation era of Maker. I mean, the brightest minds from Kenya, from Tanzania, from all over the continent were flocking to this one campus.
And the roster of students sharing dorms during this era is just staggering.
It's like a who's who of African history.
It really is. It became an anti-colonial political incubator.
Mm-hmm.
You have Julius Nyerere, who goes on to become the visionary first president of Tanzania.
Yeah.
You have Milton Obote, who becomes the first prime minister and later president of Uganda. Mwai Kibaki, the future president of Kenya. All of them.
Yeah.
Literally eating in the same cafeteria.
Yeah.
Debating in the same student union.
And at the exact same time, on the exact same campus, Maker becomes the absolute cradle of modern African literature.
Yes.
You have writers emerging who would go on to define the continent's literary voice. Novelists and poets like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Okapabutek, Grace Ogot.
Here's where it gets really interesting. How does that actually happen?
What do you mean?
Well, how did one single campus manage to be the political birthplace of East African independence and the birthplace of its modern literature at the exact same time? Is it just a historical coincidence that the founding fathers of these nations and the greatest novelists of the region were, like, sharing lecture halls?
It's not a coincidence at all. It actually makes perfect sense when you understand the Pan-African identity that was being forged on that specific campus.
Okay, lay that out for me.
Well, as Westerners, we often categorize politics and literature as two completely separate academic departments, right?
You're either a policeman major or an English major.
Exactly. But that categorization completely fails to capture the reality of Maker in the 1950s.
How so?
Because for these students, political independence and literary independence were the exact same exercise.
Interesting.
They were both mechanisms for reclaiming the African narrative from the British.
Okay, walk me through how a novel does the same work as, say, a political rally.
Think about what colonialism actually does. It doesn't just extract physical resources like gold or rubber. It attempts to erase your history.
Right. It rewrites the story.
It tells you that your culture is primitive, your languages are irrelevant, and your stories only exist as, like, a savage backdrop for European protagonists to have adventures in.
So they were stripping away their humanity, basically.
Completely. So when the political leaders like Nyerere and Obote were arguing that Africans had the intellect and agency to govern themselves.
The writers were arguing the exact same thing on paper.
Exactly. So when writers like Ngugi wa Thiong'o or Chinua Achebe start publishing, they are arguing that African traditions and African languages have the complexity to be the center of their own literature.
They don't need a European protagonist.
Nope. And this all culminated in the legendary 1962 Maker Writers Conference.
I read about this in the sources. It sounded intense.
Oh, it was. This wasn't just some polite gathering to read poems and sip tea.
Right.
It was a fierce foundational debate featuring literary giants. You had Wole Soyinka and Chinua Achebe.
Incredible.
And they were actively debating the mechanics of their literary rebellion. Do we write in English to subvert the colonizers' language and force them to hear us?
Use their own tools against them.
Right. Or do we reject English entirely and write only in indigenous languages to decolonize the mind?
That is a massive philosophical question.
It really is. Writing a novel that centered the African experience wasn't just art. It was a profound act of defiance. The debates about self-governance in the dining halls fed directly into the novels being written in the dormitories.
They realized they didn't have to just inherit the world the British had built for them. They could write a new one and then govern it.
Beautifully put.
And
Yes.
that incredibly potent energy culminates beautifully in 1962. Uganda officially gains
A
independence.
huge milestone.
The British flag comes down. Maker immediately becomes the National University of Uganda, and the sources describe this as a moment of absolute euphoric triumph.
It was a time of immense optimism.
They are massively expanding programs in medicine, law, and engineering.
Yeah, they were producing the country's very first African doctors, the very first Ugandan lawyers and engineers. You have key academic leaders finally taking charge of their own curriculum.
The locals are running the show now.
Exactly. Figures like Professor Sinteza Kajubi, who became a massive force in reforming the education system to actually suit an independent African nation rather than a British colony.
Or Professor Peter Mugenye, who would later become pivotal in the global fight against HIV and AIDS.
Such critical figures.
But the reality of becoming a newly independent nation is that it is incredibly complex.
Yeah, the honeymoon phase doesn't last forever.
No, it doesn't. And the very same intellectual independence that made Maker a powerhouse suddenly made it a primary target.
Which brings us to the really dark years.
Right. The tragedy of the 1970s and 1980s, primarily under the regime of Idi Amin from 1971 to 1979.
It was a catastrophic era for Uganda, and by extension, obviously, for Maker. To understand why the university suffered so deeply, you have to look at the mechanics of authoritarianism.
Okay.
A dictator relies on absolute authority and an unquestioned version of reality.
You can't have people poking holes in your narrative.
Exactly. And a university, especially one with the DNA of Maker, exists solely to teach people how to question reality.
Right. A campus full of political scientists, free-thinking novelists, and outspoken Pan-Africanists isn't just an annoyance to a dictator, it's an existential threat.
Precisely. And Amin treated it as such. The sources describe an era of total economic collapse and severe intellectual repression.
And it wasn't just a lack of funding, right? It was actual violence.
It was targeted violence. The vice-chancellor of the university at the time, Frank Calamuzo, was actually abducted and murdered by the regime in 1972.
Just horrifying.
The brain drain was unprecedented. Academics were fleeing the country across the borders into Kenya or Tanzania just to survive.
Reading the sources, I kept trying to visualize how an institution even survives that.
Yeah.
And the analogy that makes the most sense to me isn't a building weathering a storm. It's more like a greenhouse that is suddenly plunged into a brutal, decade-long winter.
Oh, I like that.
Above ground, Maker looked entirely decimated. The brilliant professors had fled, the buildings were decaying, there was no paper to print exams on, no chemicals for the science lab.
Everything froze.
The canopy was just burned or frozen away. But underground, the academic root system went dormant and just refused to die.
Huh?
I mean, how did they actually keep the doors open when the state was actively hostile?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, that dormant root system you just described becomes Maker's most defining characteristic.
Resilience.
Right. It transforms from being just a symbol of excellence into a symbol of profound institutional resilience. How did they survive? They simply kept teaching.
Without resources.
Completely. Professors who couldn't flee or refused to flee stayed and taught lectures entirely from memory because there were no textbooks.
Wow.
Students rationed literal scraps of paper. They kept the operational machinery of the university moving, even in the darkest civil conflict and economic hardship of the 1980s.
So they preserved the institutional DNA.
Yes.
They made sure that when the winter finally ended, there was still something left to grow back.
Exactly. They proved something fundamental, you know. Political regimes, even the most brutal dictatorships, are temporary. The pursuit of knowledge is enduring.
That's incredibly powerful.
And because those professors protected that root system, when the political winter finally ended in the 1990s, the university was primed to explode back into life.
And explode it did. The 1990s roll around, and we see this incredible revival. Uganda restructures its higher education system.
Yeah, a total overhaul.
But the key mechanism here, according to the research, is that the government grants Maker a significant degree of financial and administrative autonomy.
That autonomy was the absolute game changer.
Because they could finally govern themselves.
Right. After 2 decades of a massive brain drain, you can't just slowly hire new staff and hope for the best.
You have to act fast.
You have to aggressively reintegrate with the global academic community, and you have to generate your own revenue to rebuild your shattered infrastructure.
Which they did by opening their doors much wider. They introduced these private sponsorship schemes, essentially allowing students who didn't get government scholarships to pay their own way.
Yep. Enrollment shot up exponentially.
They started offering night classes to accommodate everyone. And simultaneously, they started forging these massive, heavy-hitting international research partnerships.
We're talking institutions like Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine.
They were playing in the big leagues again.
And this is a crucial point for you to understand about modern Maker. They didn't just recover to become a good local school.
Right.
They leaped straight back to the front lines of solving global crises. Look at the groundbreaking public health research that came out of there. When the HIV/AIDS epidemic was ravaging the continent, Maker researchers didn't just wait for Western science to save them.
Right. The work done by researchers like Professor Nelson Sawankabo and Professor Francis Omaswa is legendary.
Absolutely legendary.
But I want to highlight how they did it, because it wasn't just sitting in a pristine lab looking at microscopes.
Exactly. They pioneered community-based health interventions. For example, the Rakai Health Sciences Program.
Tell me about that.
Well, Maker researchers went out into the rural villages in the Rakai district. They mapped the social geography of the communities to understand exactly how the virus was transmitting through social networks.
They went directly to the people.
They gathered data from the ground up, which allowed them to develop prevention strategies that actually fit the cultural and physical reality of the people living there.
Instead of just imposing a Western model that might not work.
Exactly. Their data fundamentally transformed medical education and health systems research in Uganda, and it provided an epidemiological blueprint that the rest of the world ended up adopting.
And that momentum carried right into the 21st century. Today, Maker's footprint is just massive.
It is everywhere.
They are conducting clinical trials for Ebola vaccines. They are driving vital agricultural research. I was reading in the sources about how they have artificial intelligence and ICT innovation hubs now,
Yeah, the tech scene there is booming.
where developers are creating mobile apps that allow rural farmers to scan cassava leaves with their phones to detect crop diseases using AI.
It's amazing.
It is so far beyond what anyone in 1922 could have possibly imagined. It continues to attract brilliant minds, like the late renowned political scientist Ali Mazrui. The College of Health Sciences and the Business School are the absolute anchors of the region.
It is a modern global research university in every sense of the word.
So what does this all mean? Because as amazing as this 21st century renaissance sounds, I have to push back a little on this glowing, triumphant narrative.
Fair enough. Let's hear it.
The sources we're looking at also explicitly mention that Maker today is dealing with severe modern challenges.
They are.
The massive enrollment explosion of the 90s led to severe student overcrowding. They are facing major funding constraints and serious infrastructure limits.
It's a real issue.
So if they are doing world-class AI research and partnering with Harvard on Ebola, isn't that totally at odds with the reality of an overcrowded, underfunded campus? How does a university balance being a regional lifeline that provides mass education to tens of thousands of local students while simultaneously trying to be this elite global research hub?
This raises an important question, and honestly, it is the central defining tension of modern Maker.
Yeah.
You've hit the nail on the head. The modern era of this university is defined by duality. It is both heavily resource-constrained and intellectually limitless.
But how do those two realities coexist on the same campus?
Well, because the expectation placed on an African national university is fundamentally different from the expectation placed on, say, an Ivy League school in the West.
Okay, unpack that.
Harvard exists to be elite, right?
Hmm.
It intentionally limits its enrollment to maintain a feeling of exclusivity and resource abundance.
They pride themselves on how many people they reject.
Exactly. Maker, as the premier national university of a developing nation, has a very different mandate. It has to uplift the broader population.
Right.
It has to provide mass education because the economic and social development of the entire nation depends on it.
Ah. So they can't just close the iron gates and say, we only take the top 1%. Everyone else is out of luck.
Exactly. They have to keep the gates open. So yes, you get overcrowding, you get immense strain on the dormitories and the lecture halls.
That makes sense.
But within that very same crowded campus, you have sheer brilliance. And here is the secret. Being resource constrained often drives better, more applicable innovation.
What do you mean?
When you are studying climate change or food security or viral outbreaks at Maker, you aren't studying them in the abstract from an air-conditioned, pristine lab 5,000 miles away from the problem.
You are right in the middle of it.
You are studying them on the front lines.
The problems are right outside the campus gates, so the solutions you engineer have to actually survive in the real world.
Exactly.
A perfect lab solution doesn't help a rural farmer with crop disease, but an AI app on a cheap smartphone does.
Precisely. That tension between providing mass education and conducting elite research isn't a failure of the system. It is the unique friction that makes Maker's modern output so incredibly valuable to the rest of the world.
That is such a powerful way to look at it. And it brings us to why understanding this one specific university on the hills of Kampala matters so much to you listening right now.
Yeah, it's highly relevant.
If you want to understand the modern trajectory of Africa,
Mm.
if you want to understand its political leadership, the soul of its literature, or its public health triumphs against diseases like HIV and Ebola, you don't just look at a map of the continent. You look at Maker.
It is a perfect microcosm of the African experience over the last 100 years.
Yeah.
I mean, from the suffocating grip of colonialism to the euphoria of independence, through the trauma and collapse of authoritarianism, all the way to a vibrant, forward-looking yet complicated modern era.
We started this deep dive talking about a humble, restricted technical school built to train a handful of carpenters,
14 boys.
14 boys. And it ended up building presidents, poets, scientists, and the entire intellectual foundation of East Africa. But the source material makes a point to say that Maker's story is still being written.
It absolutely is.
So as we wrap up today, where does the story go next?
I think the most important takeaway for anyone listening is this. We live in a world that is completely obsessed with places like Silicon Valley or Oxford or MIT when we look for the future.
Sure.
But given its century-long history of doing the impossible, I want you to consider a completely different possibility. When the next major global crisis hits, whether it's an unprecedented climate shock, a massive breakdown in global food security, or the outbreak of a terrifying new pandemic,
Yeah?
what if the solution doesn't come from a billionaire's pristine tech campus in the West? What if the answers we desperately need come from an overcrowded, underfunded, yet fiercely resilient university in East Africa?
Wow.
A place that has already spent a century proving everyone wrong.
I absolutely love that. Maybe the next time the world needs saving, we won't need an algorithm from Silicon Valley. We'll just need another brilliant carpenter from Kampala ready to build a new shelf. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We'll see you next time.